Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the second installment of the Cities and Environment Research Network discussion series. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. We're very happy to have you with us. So my name is Nina Araneta Alana. I'm a PhD student at the Melbourne Law School, and I'll be one of the moderators for tonight's discussion. Before we begin, I will give a brief introduction about our group and set out the house rules for our discussion. Thereafter, my co-moderator, Dr. Reden Resho, will introduce the topic for tonight's webinar, as well as our speakers. Can everyone see my screen? Hang on. So our group is the Cities and Environment Research Network. It is a gathering of postgraduate scholars, PhD candidates, postdocs, and lecturers who are primarily based in Australian universities, with research in the juncture of urbanization, the built environment, climate change and disaster, public art, learning environments, informalities, and allied fields, as they relate to the Philippine and Filipino context. The CERN discussion series is our response to the ongoing global pandemic. Our research interests intersect with many of the issues that the pandemic has brought forward. Now for some housekeeping matters for tonight's discussion. We'd like to request everyone to turn off their video cameras and to keep their audio muted in order to preserve bandwidth and to ensure that the presentations are given without distraction. You may use the chat feature to type in your comments, or if you have to communicate something to the moderators. During the Q&A, please use the raise hand function. It's at the bottom of your screen. It's one of the functions at the bottom of your screen, and we will acknowledge you. You may turn on your video and audio to pose your question, but if you're experiencing any technical problems, which we encountered the last time we did this, you may use the chat function instead, and we'll read out your question. This webinar is being recorded and may be shared to a broader audience at a later date. For your information, the first CERN discussion series on the right to the city is now online and may be viewed at the CERN Melbourne YouTube channel. The webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour, with each panelist presenting for 10 minutes. You will have time for questions at the end. So I will now yield the floor to Dr. Reden Resho to introduce the topic and our speakers.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm Reden. I'm with the University of Melbourne's Informal Urbanism Hub. I'll be co-moderating this second webinar of CERN. So let me share my screen to introduce the speakers. Okay, so our discussion today is titled Constructing and Communicating Crisis Narratives in the Time of COVID-19. In this second CERN webinar, we aim to unpack how multiple perspectives and competing narratives around COVID crisis management are framed and communicated. We will examine how certain values are being promoted while some voices are ignored in the process. We'll also touch on some practical tips on how to better communicate to groups who are often vilified in COVID conversations. So we have 4 speakers who will each contribute to our discussion. Our first discussant is Dennis Sumailo, a graduate of Communication Arts and Development Communication from the University of the Philippines. He is currently pursuing his PhD in Media and Communication with specialization in disaster risk communication and in communities in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas. For today's discussion, Dennis will explain how these communities use and respond to various risk communication tools with some references to the current COVID-19 pandemic. Our next discussant is Erica M. Carrion. Erica co-founded and co-edited Plural Online Journal. She is half of the indie publishing duo Occult's Razor with Newbie Gonzalez. Erica completed her BA and MFA at De La Salle University, Manila, where she taught with the literature department. She is currently taking her PhD at the University of Melbourne with a special interest in eco-fiction. Her presentation, Memetics and Populist Fairy Tales, The Stories We Propagate, will unpack the values and virtues found in the narratives we circulate amid the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The third discussant is Kyra Zoe Alburo Cañete. Kyra specializes in critical development studies with a particular focus on the intersections of gender, development, and disasters. She is currently a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales School of Social Sciences in Sydney, Australia. Her doctoral research examines the assimilation of Build Back Better in the local context of Tacloban's reconstruction after Typhoon Yolanda from the standpoint of women. Her presentation, titled Tough Love in the Time of COVID-19, Disrupting State Narratives of Care from a Feminist Perspective, will examine the stories that engender the heavy-handed implementation of community quarantines, identify the costs and dangers of such approach, and propose a rethinking of crisis governance based on a feminist ethic of care. Then our last discussant is Oscar T. Cerquina Jr., who is currently a PhD candidate in theater studies in the School of Culture and Communication of the University of Melbourne. Oscar is also a faculty member of the Department of Speech Communication and Theater Arts at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. In his presentation titled Acts of Speech, Bites of Sound, Politicizing Performance in Viral Times, Oscar will delve into the rhetorical narratives and performances from the Philippine president and Filipino netizens and artists in our viral times. So with that, let me turn you over to our first speaker, Dennis. Dennis?
Right. Hello. Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay. Good evening, everyone. Tonight's webinar aims to discuss communication, communicating crisis narratives. So I find it necessary as first speaker to differentiate crisis from risk. I must define these two because with threats of second wave due to lifting of ECQs, I believe that these terminologies will be misused later on. So risk communication involves information dissemination activities prior to any event, while crisis communication is communicating in the middle of the event. So having said that, my talk for tonight will focus on how people living in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas, or GDAS, access and process risk information. Why are their experiences important, and how is messaging done to address their information needs? Also, I will talk about the problems that they encounter when it comes to communicating risk and accessing risk information. I would like to highlight their experience because they are often left out in the national narrative delivered by the media. For instance, how many stories of people living in isolated sitios and island barangays, say in Mindanao, make it to the national news? So, why are their experiences important? Why is there a need to know the risk communication experiences of those living literally at the margins of society? First, risk communication literature already presents a technology-driven risk communication methods by using mobile applications like trackers, gamifications like Dumb Ways to Die, and social media utilization. These are actually great steps in the context of accessing and sharing information. Yet, the same set of literature poses a gap that there is already an existing struggle between the benefits technology brings to society and the various processes required in order for the society to adopt and use a particular platform. It has been documented that with the increase in technological innovation, there is also an increase in social and economic inequality brought by several factors, such as disparities in human capital and education services required to operate these new technological innovations used in risk communication. For instance, in disaster communication, failure to heed evacuation calls from the government is attributed to locals' belief that they know more about their surroundings, and traditional warnings like movements of animals from the boondocks going down. In one local story in Davao City, for instance, a COVID-19 patient who escaped from an isolation facility was rescued, and the public court, called social media, made fun of this person's ignorance of the severity of this pandemic and her situation. It was later discovered that this patient's cultural identity is Bajau. This often maligned and misunderstood cultural minority group living in urban spaces in Mindanao led to more online bashing. Yet, authorities should know that there is no singular mold of individual, and this patient may not understand the severity of the health crisis because it is not within her cultural consciousness. In my own fieldwork, for example, there were conversations I had with informants relaying that the indigenous people often ground their experiences with natural hazards on their beliefs. For example, earthquakes are caused by giants living underground, or they were being punished by Magbabaya, the supreme creator. But this kind of processing information and experience is not actually unique to IPs. Fishermen read the sea and the wind. They develop this heightened sense because of their experiences. Yet it has been reported by DRRM officers that the IPs are actually the most active and open to all of these DRRM trainings and drills. Although it takes effort to explain the science aspect of the risks they face, it is not impossible to do so. Authorities and people in general with less experience dealing with other people coming from different cultural backgrounds would easily judge others based on the only criteria they know. I also believe that media coverage can be a form of privilege. Lucky are those who get media coverage. The provision of media mileage means you are able to put out your story. And those areas that I talked about, or group of people with enough media mileage, often receive the things they need, either from the government or non-government agencies. This privilege of media mileage is not enjoyed by everyone, especially communities classified as GIDAs. How do people live in GIDAs access and process information? Who are the people living in GIDAs? Actually, these are people who belong to vulnerable sectors living in precarious situations like having no access to safe roads and public transportation, no communication signal, intermittent access to potable water and electricity, or these are people who are recovering from or in the middle of armed conflict. In Mindanao, Jidas are often considered home to indigenous peoples. Next, how is messaging done? And what are the problems encountered? I argue that risk communication in general needs to be multimodal, but there are certain modes of communication that are suitable for specific groups of people, like JIDA communities. And these communication tools work for them. However, there are problems unique to this pandemic that affect the mode of communication preferred by JIDA communities. First, since technology-dependent mode of communication does not work in these areas, people rely on face-to-face communication. However, this mode defeats the social distancing protocol and other protocols of this pandemic. Second, people living in JIDAs are semi-blinded by what is happening in the country and the rest of the world because of limited access to information sources. Why? They have intermittent access to electricity. They have no communication signal, and there is no immediate way to contact the outside world. Third, despite living in geographically isolated areas, they are very aware of the presence of fake news. They are extremely aware of the dangers of getting wrong information from anybody. A reliable source should be available for them. And to these communities, the reliable sources are often government officials, and by government officials, barangay officials, and sometimes mass media when they're able to access television and radio. However, most of their information are from trusted neighbors and relatives. Having said that, the next thing that we should talk about would be how should communicating risk be done in their context? Given their situation, the question now is, how do we ensure that they have access to information? First, let me go back to my argument that risk communication should be multimodal. However, the multimodality of risk communication can be affected by political complications and leadership instability. These political complications often lead to reducing the choices of modes of communication of any individual or group. Second, maintaining multiple choices of modes of communication can also address issues on, say, people's literacy level. It provides an individual a chance to choose his or her own mode of communication based on her or his information needs, technological skills, and level of understanding. As communicators, it is now our job to make our messaging direct, simple, and frequent. We must ensure that the messaging also fits the desired mode of communication. This way, our message consumers would be able to easily digest the information we relay. Third, interpersonal communication is an integral risk communication tools for communities living in geographically isolated and socially and economically disadvantaged areas. The mode of information dissemination via a third party, such as the barangay captain and the purok leader, is grounded on the level of trust towards the source rather than the content. So, rather than building on your referent power to gain loyal followers, one should work on building trust by providing people their needs. And as closing statement, I want to share Mendy and colleagues' argument of what messaging should be observed at this time of pandemic. According to them, there are three important messages we would all want to hear right now. First, guidelines set by an institution or organization to ensure that we are all safe. Second, how to continue living with these guidelines and restrictions. And third, to ensure that people will be able to process the impacts of this pandemic to all aspects of life post-COVID-19. We are not yet at the third type of messaging. And to be honest, I believe that those living in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas will continue to be neglected in terms of accessing frequent and context-appropriate risk information in this current situation. With that, thank you and good evening.
Thank you, Dennis, for a lot of insights on the multimodality of communication and the different messaging forms. So we'll now proceed to our second speaker, Erica.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, so I'm just going to be generally talking about some of the recurring values or virtues that we would usually hear about during a crisis in the Philippines, but have now especially been exacerbated by the COVID-19 health crisis, as well as the current political situation at home. So usually when we, for example, talk about the Filipino resilience, no matter what kind of disaster it would be it natural disasters or man-made disasters, etc., there are always these reactions that circulate around discipline and obedience, positive attitudes, authority figure as a strong, almost parental figure, and hero figures or sacrificial or martyr figures. So we always see this kind of underdog narrative also in a lot of the opinions we see online. And I think that right now we see a lot of those attitudes coalescing in what we call the pasaway. So this is not the first time that we would see the word or the concept of the pasaway, or one who flouts the rules or one who is hard-headed, deployed a lot in conversation with regard to crisis in the Philippines. But it is also especially deployed by the state right now. And also in the media, we see a lot of headlines. For example, this is just a screenshot of some of the articles, opinion pieces or think pieces that use the idea of the pasaway as an anchor for looking at attitudes and behaviors of Filipinos during pandemic. And what this indicates in my observations is that this pasaway narrative, which is definitely anchored towards a rhetoric that has to do with discipline or the lack thereof of Filipinos, is rooted in a kind of anxiety that populist narratives or populist myth-making or populist fairy tales, as I would like to call it, would usually share. So we see examples of this here. We see one of the more recent headlines, follow the rules or be evicted from homes, and the word pasaway is also used to describe this attitude. This is also another example of how netizens would deploy the word pasaway to describe the failure of social distancing measures. So both the state as well as ordinary citizens use the pasaway narrative as a way to kind of explain why government measures right now are failing. So I'll be focusing more on the attitudes that surround that that way of thinking. Okay, so recently also, this another term or another concept that seems to also be gaining traction with regard to COVID-19 measures is how the middle class reacts to these inefficiencies. So this is an example of the kind of attitudes that the state has towards Filipino middle class citizens. And again, this kind of reaction also speaks to the anxieties that surround being Filipino and middle class. This is another example. So this is written by the children's writer, Genaro Gojo Cruz. So just to summarize this open letter, it is coming from the perspective of...
Erica, can you click on the images? Because I think we are...
Oh, sorry.
We're unable to see some of the images you're trying to show.
And is that working?
I think you have to share screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Better.
Okay. So what I'm sharing right now is an excerpt from another post that had gone viral, which I think also summarizes some of what we would call middle class, Filipino middle class anxieties towards the current situation. So to summarize, sorry, excuse me. Okay, so from this excerpt, you can see that this anxiety speaks to a seeming unfairness towards how government has allocated its resources. But this unfairness is also a burden not on the state, but on the lower class, or also on the individuals who would benefit seemingly from ayuda or from government help. So this is another example of these anxieties that we would see surrounding crisis situations like the pandemic right now. So these anxieties are part of what we would say the anxieties of the virtuous that a populist, nationalist approach towards leadership would usually take advantage of. And I'm just going to share the whole screen. Okay, I'm just what I'm sharing right now are excerpts from lyrics that of a song that in the recent press conference by President Duterte, he basically plays this song at the end of the press conference, and it's interesting to see also the narrative that the song includes in its lyrics. So you could see from these lyrics that it also paints the figure of a martyr, a strong man who leads a nation towards survival. So this is an example of what would be called values that espouse populist nationalism. So what exactly is populist nationalism? So it is a kind of populism that focuses on an underdog versus an elite kind of situation. So this is different from the kind of populism that we would see in Europe that tends to be more xenophobic, and us versus them that is grounded on ethnicity. Now, according to Adele Webb and Nicole Corrato, the kind of populism that Duterte represents is populism of is the particular kind of populism that that comes from that underdog versus elite narrative. So it's not, so it's different from that xenophobic, ethnicity rooted populism, but one that is deeply rooted in the colonial past and the recent history of the Philippines. So according to Webb and Corrato, this particular climate fosters, or this kind of colonial background really fosters a kind of anxiety with regard to sovereignty, autonomy, self-determination. And it is this kind of narrative that a lot of leaders in our past have sought to exploit. So Webb and Corrato have given examples from during the Spanish colonial period and the insurrection during that time. The Katipunan have used that particular kind of rhetoric. They also give examples of They also give examples of how presidents like Diosdado Macapagal and most notably Marcos have also used this narrative and the underlying anxieties that such a revolution towards self-determination and sovereignty have yet to be really achieved. So Marcos have exploited that to full effect. And the interesting point that Webb and Corrato have said is that with Duterte right now, what he has done is not so much disrupt, the current political discourse, but have exploited it to full effect. So so Webb and Corrato say that what he is doing is just a continuation of these kinds of narratives. And in fact, they also give an example of ERAP, Estrada, by using the outlaw persona, and one that is able to relate empathically to the poor, the lower class, as an example of a figure that has paved the way for the kind of populism that Duterte espouses. So, and the interesting thing about Webb and Corrado's point is that one of the things that have made Duterte successful is how these anxieties have cultivated the fears of a particular class of Filipino with regard to being virtuous. So these anxieties towards the instabilities of life and how the promises of past presidencies and liberal democracy have not given them the fair share of the pie, so to speak. So to paraphrase Webb and Corrato, the anxieties of the virtuous is something that the Duterte regime has exploited to full effect in order to drive a larger wedge between classes. So the reason why I use in the title of my presentation, Memetics and Fairy Tales, is because fairy tales in a way are similar to the way in which populist, nationalist narratives propagate these values in order to cement their power, are similar to how fairy tales operate. So according to Jack Zipes, Jack Zipes discusses fairy tales as a kind of meme, ideas that propagate precisely because they say something about our survival as a civilization. So he says that basically we are drawn to certain fairy tales because they try to raise issues that are socially important, and these socially important issues try to give us a signpost for how to survive in the world.
Erica?
Yes.
Maybe a few seconds to wrap up.
Okay. So I'm basically drawing a parallel between popular fairy tales. For example, if you could recall, Cinderella, Snow White, Red Riding Hood, and why these seem so popular in our collective unconscious is because they answer questions about how to behave in a civilized manner in a given particular crisis situation, which is similar to the kinds of narratives that a populist, nationalist kind of rhetoric usually takes advantage of, because it is rooted in the anxieties, particularly middle-class anxieties, of how to survive in an increasingly precarious situation. So the pasaway, I would venture to say, is kind of populist fairy tale that evolves depending also on those particular fears and anxieties that exist in the Filipino middle class.
Yeah. Thank you, Erica, for unpacking how the different narratives are actually rooted in different forms of anxieties and populist and even nationalist rhetoric. So we will now go to our third discussant, Kyra.
I need to share my slide, Erica. Maybe you can unshare. Yes, thank you. All right, so thank you so much for the introduction. And so I'm going to tackle tonight in my discussion the question, do tough love approaches work in managing a pandemic? So as the Philippines grapple with local outbreaks of COVID-19, the government has taken a tough stance in managing the spread of the virus, which has to date already claimed more than 800 lives in the country. Stringent enforcement of community quarantines and intolerance for so-called lockdown violators mark the administration's crisis response. So a familiar narrative might sound like this: just obey. The enforcement of lockdowns may be harsh, but it is for your own good. Tough times call for tough measures. Consider this tough love. So in the everyday use of the term, tough love is an expression which describes how someone, usually a person in authority, treats another person harshly or sternly, but supposedly does so for the other person's own good. I find this expression apt in describing the state's narrative of care in the handling of the COVID-19 crisis, and take this as a starting point for seeking out an alternative framework for crisis governance based on a different ethics of care drawn out from feminist practice, which I engage with in more depth in my work on women's experience of post-Yolanda reconstruction. Now, I want to discuss three things within the 10 minutes that is given to me. So first, where can we find tough love narratives being embedded and embodied in the Philippines crisis response? Second, what are the consequences, costs, and dangers of continuing with such framings? And third, what alternative approaches to care might produce more responsive and attentive ways of governing crisis situations? Now, this slide, the leftmost photo taken at a PNP checkpoint upon the enforcement of community quarantines, is very interesting to me. On one hand, it relays a message of care. Stay home, we are here to protect you. We care about your health. And mobilize the sentiments of solidarity and community. But on the other hand, the photo also exudes intimidation. It is of men wearing camouflage uniforms, fully armed, and are allowed to use force to ensure compliance. Thus, we find paradoxes shaping in this narrative. So on one hand, you have care, solidarity, community, communicated through the slogan of "We heal as one." But on the other hand, you have force, intimidation, shoot them dead pronouncements. Now, in many disaster and crisis situations, it is not uncommon for the state to assume a posturing of care and concern. In fact, presenting such effective qualities contributes to a great extent to the legitimacy of crisis governance. In my own research on disaster reconstruction, I have identified a particular mode of governing, which I call benevolent discipline. But I cannot go into more detail about this, but there are some features that define it. So first, you have a state that positions itself as a benevolent authority and enacts discipline as its expression of care, and it uses force when disciplining fails. Of course, the act of disciplining requires a referent object, one that it views as a group with deficiencies that need correction. While my research focused on a different context, I could see some similarities in the ways that the state represents itself as a benevolent authority in the COVID-19 crisis and the ways in which it has targeted the poor as the object of discipline. Now, over the last few weeks, various observers and commentators have raised concerns that lockdown measures are resulting in the criminalization of the poor's difficulties in complying with quarantine policies. So-called violators are arrested, caged, beaten up, and humiliated as a form of punishment. On social media, it also gets ugly. The poor become vilified as salot, pasaway, matigas ang ulo. Tough measures are needed to discipline people, so it has been said. Severe enforcement of quarantines are working, so we have been told. Perhaps, but at what cost? We see how violence has become a norm in enforcing policies. In fact, it has become entrenched in the everyday embodied practice of law enforcers as a rule rather than as an exception. The impunity with which such acts are committed also speaks volumes about the normalization and institutionalization of violence enacted supposedly at the point of care, using the narrative of keeping people safe. Tough love also perpetuates paternalism and is consequently disempowering. Tough love, which is performed and articulated largely from the perspective of the powerful, creates blanket measures that ignore social conditions, relations, and inequalities. Thirdly, it creates what I call social distancing in a sociological sense, wherein there is an imagining of a group of socially and spatially distant others that disables our capacities to extend empathy towards those who are now cast as violators, matigas ang ulo, troublemakers. In other words, this narrative of care impedes our ability to care for and about fellow human beings. In fact, I was aghast by a particular comment I read on social media, which suggested that we just burn down entire urban poor communities because the people who inhabit these settlements endanger the lives of so-called law-abiding citizens who have the common sense to stay at home. Now, can we consider tough love as a form of care? A simple answer would be yes, it can be construed as care, but care is also a contested term and certainly can be provided in ways that are oppressive, insensitive, and ineffective. The million-dollar question would be, is this good care? So in the second half of my presentation, I would like to explore facets of care that enable individuals, groups, communities, and institutions to actually respect and uphold rights, to take account of various interests and needs, and refrain from the use of violence and aggression as a means of achieving a supposedly safer world. And I take as a starting point to pursuing such ethic of care based on the following definition on the screen. Scholarship on care ethics have drawn heavily on feminist analysis of care relationships at various scales of human experience, but most specifically within the micro-moral domains of the home. And one of the most important contributions of feminist scholarship in this regard is the politicization of care and the elevation of the value of care as something that is as important, if not constitutive, of the value of social justice. We pursue a more just world not simply because we recognize it as important, but because we are emotionally invested in it. In other words, we care enough to do something about injustice. So here I attempt to draw out how we can create caring institutions on a wider scale based on feminist ethics. Now, recently, crisis leadership has been evaluated along gendered lines with questions like, are female leaders more successful at managing crises, especially in the face of the seemingly poor performance of states led by populist, macho strongman leaders? ethics of care expressed through the values of empathy and attentiveness have been identified as what set leadership styles apart. While it might seem like a vindication for the feminist movement to claim that female leaders have done well because they are women, I would caution against this line of argument, as first, it essentializes women as naturally caring, and second, it once again shoves the responsibility of care work to women. And we have our own examples of how the ability to care is not necessarily associated with one's gender. For example, on one hand here, we have Governor of Cebu, Gwendolyn Garcia, who has taken on quite explicitly a tough stance in the crisis response. And on the other, we have Pasig Mayor Vico Soto, who has gained popularity with what is perceived as a sensitive approach to the needs of the most vulnerable. Now, please don't take this as a political endorsement, but rather as an observation. So what my point is, rather than debate on which gender can do better or can care better, I would rather focus on how we can create institutions that can care well. So what do we mean by care ethics in institutions? It would perhaps be useful to first have a picture of what it shouldn't be. So what are the signs of institutions that are not caring so well? I won't go through this one by one, but just highlight certain points. So first, we can tell if misfortune or crisis causes the need for care. So here, care is only invoked when there is a crisis. So we find people coming together in short spurts of solidarity, and then we go back to an existence of indifference, business as usual. Second, needs are taken as a given. They're static, unchanging, simplified, and it has no regard for particularities of need. Next, receivers of care are excluded from decisions, and inherently this becomes a very disempowering act of caring. Lastly, care work falls on a specific group, usually women or the lower class, and it is often devalued, and it is not adopted as a general practice. So how do we create caring institutions in the time of COVID-19? So I'm adopting here Joan Tronto's framework for creating caring institutions. So she talks about the 3 Ps. First is power, especially inequalities that exist even within caring relationships, in order to avoid the dangers of paternalism and parochialism. Plurality, as well as particularity of needs, conditions, and means of responding to such. And lastly, purpose. We need to have a discussion regarding the ends and purposes of providing care. For example, do we enforce quarantines simply to stop the spread of disease? Or do we include in our policy making how we might approach these challenging conditions with considerations for well-being of people? So lastly, as my concluding thoughts, if you want an ethic of care to permeate our institutional processes, one that is anchored on values of empathy, attentiveness, mutuality, and responsibility, then tough love approaches to the current crisis really need to be discarded. Instead, the pockets of short-term support and aid to vulnerable groups and communities must be sustained through normalizing caring responses to the ongoing and everyday structural injustices, poverty, and social inequalities that hinder people's abilities to survive this current crisis. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Kyra, for that provocative discussion on the costs and implications of a state approach that actually deploys care and discipline in managing the COVID crisis. So guys, if you have questions, just list them down and we will try to discuss them when we go to the open forum. So for our final speaker for tonight, we'll have Oscar. OJ?
Done. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining in. It's my first time to talk about my topic, so please be patient with me. These are incipient thoughts, not related at all to what I'm currently doing, but it's something that I would like to share with all of you. Can you see my screen? Can you see my how do I do this?
Not yet, OJ.
Not yet? Okay. Share screen. Okay, there you go. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm just like, okay. Okay. A national leadership that hangs in midair compounds our extended days of dread and uncertainty in the age of COVID-19. We have found ourselves glued to our TV or computer screens, hardly taking a hold of the constantly changing schedules of Duterte's public addresses. At one point or another, have been baffled by the uncoordinated announcements from the government about the implementing rules and regulations of the enhanced community quarantine. All the time, we suffer Duterte's dragging and droning yakking on national TV, if not his protracted and circuitous meetings with his cabinet members. We already know that Duterte has led COVID-19 infected Philippines with much fury and fanfare. His non-supporters have often argued quite accurately that Duterte does not have a method to the madness of this global pandemic. I argue, though, that madness is in itself his method. With Duterte at the helm, the Philippines is currently confronting two salient types of wars: a war against the virus on the one hand, and a war of words from the president on the other hand. Madness as the chief method of his political performance operates on bottomless frenzy and intends to fatigue. Like symptoms of COVID-19, it can make you feverish and nauseous. It drags on and drains you until you can no longer sense, taste, and smell properly the body politic. No other president has trained our attention on the centrality of the mouth as a remarkable instrument in political performance and communication than Duterte. If the coronavirus can be transmitted through what comes out of the mouth, Duterte's virulence gets ferried across through his oral hygiene or the lack of it. Hence, way before COVID-19 has made the word viral more real in our popular imagination, Duterte has already been circulating a virus of sorts in our everyday lived realities, particularly through his illiberal speeches and political decisions. Like the virus that stays in the air and sticks on surfaces before it finally infects its target, Duterte's political performances linger, infect, until they finally take effect on institutional and individual bodies like, for example, ABS-CBN, the New People's Army, staunch critics like Chel Jokno, and oppositional mass organizations like Kadamay, to name a few. Indeed, in the Philippines, the pathological virus connects with a political virulence not only from the president, but also from what have been called the troll armies of die-hard Duterte supporters. To date, there is no known vaccine to cure both the viral and the virulent, and we are all made vulnerable to their infections. However, while COVID-19 and Duterte are raging on, the resolve of a number of Filipinos to struggle and survive, to persist and resist, has become more prominent. Even or especially while at home and away from one another, Filipinos have taken Duterte's government to task for its impromptu leadership in the time of COVID-19. And Filipinos do so, if I may add, with equal measure of dizzying agitation and steadfast indefatigability. Like the virus, such acts of resistance actively mutate day by day. And like any vaccine to the ailing human body, they are meant to address and hopefully rectify ailments of the body politic. In this discussion, I would focus on the politicization of performance as a form of resistance in the age of COVID-19. Before I proceed, I would like to define my terms. I understand politics not merely as a contestation of power between or among parties, or the governance of a country or area and its populations. Instead, I take my cue from the French philosopher Jacques Rancière, who takes politics to mean as a distribution of the sensible. To me, to be political is to absorb, attend to, and act towards a turning environment. I deploy performance, on the other hand, to refer to any sensorial or embodied instantiation of socio-historical incidents. My specific concern here is the politicization of performances by Filipinos, not the political performances of national leaders like Duterte, that manifest on the web in our viral times. If the president has relied heavily on his, what I call, oral flexing, Filipinos have marshaled what I will call online flexing to counterpoint the hegemonic narratives coming from Duterte's administration and its actual or algorithmic followers during this health crisis. Such online flexing from a resistive and restless public is a way not only to churn out crisis narratives, but also to act with creative and critical emergency. In what follows, I will survey how the internet forced Filipinos to politicize their performances or to redraw what it means to become political. First, online flexing involves performances that maximize existing media infrastructures to entertain and educate, to report the state of their local affairs, and even agitate the status quo. On Facebook, Filipino artists have live streamed their monovlogs and other kinds of performances to sustain their respective audiences and communities. On Zoom, scientists and social scientists have initiated group discussions and webinars on issues left without sufficient discussion or attention. Therein, singers have also launched virtual concerts to raise funds or to simply provide entertainment to our troubled selves in an equally troubled society. On TikTok, ordinary citizens have released mini performances parodying politicians, for instance, to mark their blunders in public. Second, online flexing constitutes and is constituted by performances that attentively poach on and appropriate the language and image of those in power. For instance, linguistic tactics of resistance include the proliferation of hashtags like hashtag tulong hindi kulong and hashtag ayuda hindi bala from the concerned artists of the Philippines, or the use of the tagline or the use of the phrase or this line walang ganon Mars by Ate Marites to express disbelief, political statement, or to expose the absurdity of a proposed government project. Embodied tactics of resistance involve the resignification and re-embodiment of texts and performances from popular personalities to forward a political agenda. We see this more recently in Norvi Hiron's musicalization and politicization of Kim Chiu's infamous statements, now known as Law of the Classroom. Another example is the Miss Uni 2020 Quarantine Edition video that features teenage gays from an urban poor community who expose not only the direness of their lives, but also the sordid state of the country's health system as they catwalk, introduce themselves, and engage in the question and answer portion of a mock beauty contest. Dulaan Sipatlawin has also set forth its theatrical capacities and political commitments through what it calls PoliTikTok. Virtual tactics of resistance, moreover, playfully deploy the images of politicians, mixing and matching them with cartoon characters or cinematic figures, largely to criticize the rhetorical or behavioral performances. Coco Pimentel was lampooned as Dora the Explorer, for example, and more recently, upon the palace's announcement that no mass testing would take place in the country, Duterte was turned into Elsa in the Filipino film classic Himala, starring Nora Honor, whose line, "Walang Himala," has become, in the meme, "Walang mass testing." Third, online flexing covers people who perform their shifting roles to dutifully respond to the needs of the moment. Here, we see ordinary citizens become instant activists and celebrities, that is, subjects of memes, TV features, and TikTok or YouTube videos that take us by storm. We witness artists like Angel Locsin, or commercial companies like Ligo and Ginebra become advocates of social causes, mouthpieces of political slogans, and announcers of political information. We encounter academics become intermediaries of donation drives between the elite intellectual enclaves to which they belong and the social communities they work with. We meet medical frontliners and scientists become performers, reporters on the ground, and even whistleblowers. At a broader level, furthermore, multi-sectoral alliances between or among institutional, non-institutional, and anti-institutional entities, such as artist collectives, media companies, urban poor communities, health professional groups, labor unions, and peasant organizations, come into existence at this time, sometimes in unprecedented ways, as calls for the new normal intensify. And finally, online flexing permits vaster, spontaneous, cost-specific, crisis-responsive performances to take place. No other period in contemporary history have we seen the internet enabling people's networks and net worth play out radically. Online donation drives abound. Unremunerated web productions by Filipino celebrities pile up day by day. Concert tributes for frontliners, care of theater and entertainment artists, choral groups, symphony orchestras proliferate. And the free streaming of theater, film, and concert, previously inaccessible performances, has become the trend. In all these examples, performance is politicized as a tactical medium and methodology of dissent. We not only speak, but also perform back to power. We offer performative acts of sustenance and care for ourselves and for others while demanding structural support from the government. We widen the modes and movements of our dissent through art and performance. Can our traditional conceptions of art and performance still stand while we are on lockdown and in a and imagining a post-COVID-19 world? Do art and performance still matter at a time when people are getting infected, losing their jobs, and dying? In my estimation, they still do, and in many ways at that, especially when art and performance attune themselves to our rapidly mutating contexts. As netizens turned performers of sorts, we must every now and then responsively clarify why our performance-based resistances must necessarily take on their current substance and shape. Instead of asking, do art and performance still matter? We might want to ask, in what form can they matter more now? If there is any art and performance-related lesson that can be obtained at this point of our viral times and our virulent political climate in the Philippines, that might be entertainment can serve as education, artistry as activism, performance as protest, politics as entertainment, and science as sociology or social work. Now more than ever, we are contaminating one another's vocabulary and laws of practice. Health, art and culture, politics, labor, environment, and society can exist, and they do exist in one breath. I would like to end by saying, however, that the question about politicizing performance must get past acts of charity, acts of critique, and acts of representing oneself and others. As we imagine a social future more inhabitable with or without COVID-19 in our midst, performance must transcend into acts of collaboration and care. This is to say that apart from performing for, about, and with others, we must also be able to perform with others in a more horizontal rather than vertical scheme, and with keen awareness of the fact that despite or maybe because of our viral times, the air we breathe is more or less one and the same, and that our breaths can, and they do, affect us in more ways than one. I do not wish to sound naive here, nor do I wish to end my discussion with what Laurent Berlant calls cruel optimism. Rather, I wish to capture an extraordinary time when the sensible, that is what we see, what we hear, what we sense, is undergoing some crucial rearrangement. Broadly conceived performances are focal here, to say the least. Our speeches act upon, and our sound bites bite, and our sounds bite those in power. Their waywardness matches Duterte's madness. Their aggression hurts a government of purported strongmen with vulnerable egos. Their comedies are indeed our bureaucrats' tragedies. But just like asking if exposing ourselves to the so-called outside world is safe in these viral times, we must also inquire, are we ever really protected once our performances go viral in our virulent political climate? Living at a time when we hear Duterte's henchmen at once telling the public not to threaten the president and arresting ordinary citizens who do so, no matter how mockingly and exaggeratedly, case in point Ronel Mas and Ronald Kibuyan, we realize that politicized performances of ordinary Filipinos will always be met with the policing power of the state. In this condition of capture, we further recognize that while the internet offers a level of autonomy for people to politicize performances in the age of COVID-19, it also lays bare the unequal vulnerabilities of those who do so to state violence and repression. Of course, the logical responses are to alertly call out the current dispensation's excesses and bear its double standards in implementing the laws of the land. These efforts, without a doubt, demand our constant will to act and our constant will to perform. But they also require untiring drives to revitalize the language in which we speak, to reassemble our modes of performance, and to recalibrate our social and political imaginations in ways that expose the violence of the state and that show our accumulative crises pre and during this global pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, OJ, for those insights. You've covered a lot. You've talked about the incoherent messages from those in power, the incisive parodies of the less powerful, and even the politics behind solidarity-based practices and performances of some artists. So I think with that, Nina, we're going to open, or we'll go now to the open discussion.
So if anyone wants to ask a question, I already see that in the group chat there's a comment from Jean who has left the discussion. But while we're waiting for, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand. There's an option in the bottom, raise your hand. And I think that our speakers have kindly agreed to stay on a little bit more to answer any questions that you may have. But in the meantime, I'll read out this comment of Jean. She said that she would like to add that it is not only a matter of modalities, but also of terminologies. There are a couple new terms which we're all exposed to: self-isolation, community quarantine and all its iterations, social distancing, mass testing. And I think that what she wanted to highlight is that among the key messages that we should recommend to Filipino health policymakers is that honesty about complete travel history or symptoms or their loved ones helps not only them but also their communities, reinforcing we heal as one or care narrative and putting public health at the forefront. So I think that that's something that maybe Dennis, you might want to comment on. He said that honesty is among one of the key messages that should be sent out to the public.
Yes, first of all, I agree that there are new terminologies coming out right now because of the pandemic, and it requires, what's that? It requires from us communicators to let other people understand it, especially with the communities that I am working with. Because even without the pandemic, there are already instances that scientific information or scientific basis of risks are not understood by everyone. So much more that we have this pandemic now. And about the honesty, yes, it's not just about the content, but it's about providing an honest information, thereby creating trust between the sender and the receiver of the messages. And in that way, if there is complete understanding between these two forces that's involved in communication process.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. And we have a question from W. Luna who raised his or her hand. If you would want to unmute yourself and show your video so we can hear your question.
How do I show my video?
You can.
Okay.
The icon.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Wendell.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks to all the speakers for the insightful, for shedding light on this topic, constructing and communicating crisis narratives. I have a question for Kyra. Hi, Kai.
Hi, Wendell.
Yeah, so I like how you deconstructed tough love or care by de-essentializing or de-genderizing it. You know, that is, as you suggested, you distinguish between ways of governing the crisis by women on the one hand and men on the other. I like especially how you contrasted the governance of Vico and Garcias, saying that, if I understood you correctly, that good care, and in this case, good governance, is not necessarily gender-based. Am I correct? All right, yeah. So I agree with you on that. Yeah, that it should not be gender-based. I'm just curious, in your research, have you discovered whether it's possible to extract practices from these good cares by these competent leaders? And I guess my question is, if tough love, care, or governance does not rely necessarily on gender, on what basis then can we say that this governance is good care?
Thank you for that very stimulating question, Wendell, and it's nice to see you here, even if it's virtual. Well, the very reason that I came to reflect on these issues, especially with the COVID-19 crisis, is basically because I have encountered it in my own research on disaster recovery and reconstruction in the context of Tacloban after Typhoon Yolanda, wherein, you know, post-disaster governance, or in parallel crisis governance, if you're going to relate it to what is currently happening now, is actually simply beyond, you know, just rebuilding, or in this case, preventing the spread of disease. So you see a lot of unraveling of so many kinds of social issues, and in fact, it reveals a lot of the injustices, inequalities that we are just beginning to highlight in our discussions. And this is where what really got me to think about perhaps a way to reimagine of doing things differently beyond critique. And that's what I really like about what OJ was saying earlier, that beyond critique, the notion of care compels us to really seek out alternatives to address these very sticky issues. And I drew on the work of Joan Tronto, which looks really at the issue of how power operates even within caring relationships, and that if we are not careful, such care can actually be very paternalistic and disempowering. And this is where I draw on the feminist ethics of care, which is anchored on issues of social justice and empowerment and all these things. So those are the 3 P's: power, particularity, and purpose. To what ends are we providing care? Did I answer your question, Wendell?
I guess so, yeah. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Kyra and Wendell. At this point, we'd like to call on one of our CERN members, Lizelle, who has been very helpful in our CERN discussion series. She also works in the field of communication.
Yeah.
And
she's our resident communication practitioner.
Yes. Who might have some insights to share based on the discussions earlier.
Hi guys, can you see me?
We can't see you
No.
yet.
Okay.
Oh, there, we can see you now.
Okay, cool. So I just got a couple of takeaways, if that's fine. It's not really a question, but more of takeaways. And most of the discussions are about production from the government or from the leaders. So I would probably want to give some of my 2 cents when it comes to social media consumption and production as a consumer, or as a netizen. So as we all know, the COVID-19 outbreak response on social media increases public confusion about who and what information sources to trust, which generated fear and anxiety, as you have been seeing all over Facebook and Instagram. You know, people are posting their own versions of hashtag this is my version of anxiety at the moment, and hashtag mental health awareness and stuff like that. So I guess what we can do as netizens would be to filter what we consume and discern fake news from the truth before we hit share. And the more you question what you read, the sturdier the truth, you know. That protects you from those digital vigilantism and scapegoating and xenophobia. Some of my takeaways from OJ's discussion about art actually is art entertainment, I think, also fosters hope. Artists all around the world are adapting to shutdowns by swapping physical performance spaces for virtual ones, and they share musical joy during these trying times. And you know, maybe netizens are also flexing or doing some online flexing because we're all adjusting to the new reality, and people find solutions in order to support each other, and that is one way. Creative forces help us to think outside of the box and use innovation to keep our social connection. And I guess for leaders, or for leaders' perspective, some of my takeaways when it comes to effective leadership communication would be to choose candor over charisma. This is just my observation. This is not a political comment or whatsoever. But you know, President Rodrigo Duterte continues to enjoy majority approval and trust among Filipinos, at least according to the social media numbers, despite criticisms over his, you know, tough talking manner. And this led to the Tatay Digong brand, as known for making off-the-cuff remarks and jokes even during formal speeches. Because, you know, charisma and humor allows him to connect easily with his audience in the mass. But I guess during this particular period, trust is never more important than in a crisis. You know, we have to be honest where things stand, and we have to maintain transparency, as we have been talking about, to build loyalty and lead more effectively. Openness and transparency about the risks, about the guidelines, I think are more important than relatable humor. And that would be all.
Thank you, Lizelle. So guys, if you want to use the chat box for throwing in your questions, feel free to do so.
Okay, maybe I have a question in the meantime while waiting for, I think someone wants to type in a question. I have a question for Erica, and I wanted to ask if she had any theories or hypothesis on why Filipinos seem to be attracted to this narrative of the underdog, this fairy tale. Is it a cultural thing, or is it rooted in economic inequality? I just wanted to maybe hear some of your thoughts on this this thing that you've observed.
Okay. The reason why I wanted to emphasize the anxiety and fear that populist narratives have taken advantage of is not to say that these are false, but that they are grounded on real material conditions and a dissatisfaction with promises from previous regimes, particularly those that have taken a reformist or a liberal tack to their approach to governance. There have been observations that say that there's like a consistent swing always between populist and reformist rhetoric, and a swing between reformist and populist government. So it's always like an action-reaction. But all of this is generated by or was fostered by our colonial history, the material circumstances of the different class divides, So that underdog narrative comes from that very popular us versus them, upper versus lower class. One of its origins, you could see that also in the way revolutionary rhetoric has always vilified the Filipino elites that have collaborated with those who would undermine the sovereignty of the Filipino people as a nation. So even that idea of us meaning Filipinos as an identity, as bayan, is also constructed around those the specter of our colonial history, and it also has something to do with how, in terms of the cultural products we consume, we have a propensity for adhering to what Soledad Reyes would call the romance mode. So why do you could also see this in why there's always like facts versus fiction, especially with proliferation of fake news right now. But romance mode basically are types of narratives that have very flat characters, but also project an idealized world that we do not see in our current reality. So the romance mode, again, speaks also to those anxieties that certain material, economic, social problems have not been solved or have not been properly addressed by our current reality. And so we project that idealized version through our narratives. So fostering that idea of pasaway, us versus them, with the virtuous being the underdog, feeds into the kind of idealized narrative that we wish to see in this reality, but we do not see it.
Yeah. Speaking of the romance mode, we have a question from the chat box. How do we draw the line between romanticizing and politicizing? So we can probably hear from OJ.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to go to the heart of the question that somehow bifurcates, right? The acts of romanticizing and from the acts of politicizing. To me, these two acts do not automatically create a binary, right? The act of politicizing performance can subsume, right, acts of romanticization, right? I think they diverge at a certain point in the process when they address their particular goals. For what and for whom are you like romanticizing and politicizing a particular performance, a particular narrative? So in terms of drawing the line, I think it's hard to draw the line, but you can always ask yourself as you go along or go through the process, for what, for whom are you romanticizing and politicizing? Because, I mean, the question, I believe, comes from a presupposition that romanticizing is less radical than politicizing, right? But I do not believe that binary, right? Romanticizing can be part of the political project or the politicized project. It is how you answer the question, for what and for whom are you doing these acts, that will make the difference.
Thank you, OJ. Anyone else who wants to address that question?
We have a question from Raymond Abad.
Yeah.
So thank you for all the presentations. He has two questions. One is that recent studies show that Filipinos have lower reading comprehension than our ASEAN neighbors. How should authorities and policymakers take this point into properly communicating the risk of COVID-19 or disasters in general? And then his second question is, are memes an indication of Filipinos simplifying the issues, or is it an activism, or maybe is it a form of activism? Maybe the first question, would Dennis want to take a crack at that, seeing that it takes into account the communicating to Filipinos who may have lower reading comprehension as per the studies that were taken?
Yes. The fact that my informants are coming from geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas is already the concern of having lower reading comprehension skills is already present in that community. It's not even just lower reading comprehension skills. It's total lack of ability to read at all. So despite the efforts of, say, authorities of producing various communication collaterals for, say, COVID-19 pandemic or any natural hazards, for those for those communities whose residents have issues on literacy will still not get the message. That's why I was arguing earlier, if we can continue on pushing for a multimodal form of communicating with different sectors in the society so that the authorities or policymakers can ensure and assure that the message they want to convey will be received by others. So yes, that's a reality. It's just that to tackle this issue, it takes a lot of work coming from the policymakers and the authorities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dennis. Maybe OJ and Erica, would you like to respond to the question of memes being, is it just them Filipinos simplifying the issues, or is it a form of activism?
Do I answer that, Nina?
Yes, OJ.
Okay. I think memes can cut both ways, right? They can be forms of simplifying the issue, but even that act alone can be a form of activism, right? So I think the question here is not whether it is a simplification of a very fraught issue or if it is automatically a form of activism, but how do we widen our understanding of what activism means, right? Or how do we broaden the modalities through which activism gets coursed? So I think I'm thinking along those lines, and I do not want to automatically condescend upon popular forms.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a related question to that from a colleague of OJ at the Speech Communication Department of UP, from Junis. To Sir OJ Serquiña, I would like to ask how we should view these online performances of resistance. Are they really revolutionary in a sense that they transform into sustained performances of resistance? Or does the internet, do these online apps, numb down the essence of sustained activism? Also, how do we interpret the advertisements of products such as Ligo? Do these performances aim to resist or to sell, turning activism to consumerism? Thank you.
Okay, these are interesting questions that deserve their own webinar.
Another webinar. But I would just like to respond briefly by saying that any revolutionary project does not come wholesale, right? A revolutionary project is only as revolutionary as the successful steps that it takes along the way, right? So if these steps manifest in the forms of memes, I'm open to that. I will not foreclose that possibility. Again, maybe as a performance studies scholar,
my impulse is really to see the quality, the materiality, the sociality of a particular online stimulus, if you wish. Right. With regard to commercial companies, engaging in what we call spontaneous activism, again, of course, they mean to sell. But the intention to sell automatically contradicts acts of activism. Again, we are in an unprecedented time when the relations of dissent are shifting, right? And to foreclose those shifts in the relations of dissent is to shortchange history, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we can only take in one last question because of, in the interest of time. So I think there's one last question, Nina, from the chat box. Do you want to read it out?
Okay, I think it's more of a comment rather than a question. Going back to low tech for info dissemination, like text messaging or radio to increase reach. I think that this goes into what Dennis was saying on the multimodal ways of communication. And I think that a lot of people on the ground would really agree with that. Let's go back to these other forms of technology and, non-technology even, into communicating information, messages that need to be reached out to the public.
Yeah. And probably before we end, we can probably ask each speaker to give their final insights. Yeah, so who wants to start?
Okay,
yeah,
I'll
Dennis?
start. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll start with agreeing and disagreeing with the last comment of going low tech for information dissemination. Yes, going low tech, but at the same time, I also want to push forward that interpersonal communication, face-to-face communication, is still functions as a tool to disseminate information, especially in the areas that I've worked with, because text messaging does not even exist in that area because there is no communication signal. There are no access to electricity, etc., etc. So it's really.
What's going on, Samurai? Welcome to today's video. Today, I want to talk about how.
I'm sorry about that. And then, sorry. And then, as my closing statement, with all of these pandemic happening and all of the different sectors exposed right now in the media, I would have to say that and agree with OJ that there's no such thing as dichotomy anymore. Like, there's no urban and rural areas already. There's no such thing. One urban area can be classified into different smaller pockets of area, different silos. And each silo need a special way of communication, because each silo is composed of different kinds of people with different communication needs. And that's the reality now, rather than just pure dichotomy. And that's my last message for everyone, to think of not within categories or dual categories, but think of several sectors.
Thank you, Dennis.
Okay. As like a last word, populism or these popular narratives, as used by populist nationalist regimes, they're not negatives in themselves. You see sometimes the word populist used to explain the negative aspects of a particular regime, but what these memes or populist fairy tales expose through the exploitation of the anxieties and fears of certain sectors is that there are certain voices that have not been given precedence by certain previous regimes. And the reason why we cling to these particular fictions is because there is because of those particular inadequacies. So these populist narratives merely expose these. Sort of related to the question that OJ answered earlier. memes, popular narratives, they're not particularly negative or dumbing down issues in themselves. They're also not subversive in themselves, though they do have subversive potential precisely because of what they expose about the inadequacies of such populist discourse as exploited by previous regimes.
Yeah. Thank you, Erica. Kyra?
Yeah, I guess for me, since I've tackled on the issue of governing. So one of the most common reactions really that I get a lot is that, especially in terms of care ethics in governance, is that people say it cannot be made as a guide for the conduct of governing because it is by its very definition unscientific and irrational. And you know, we have all this privileging of what is scientific and what is rational. But I guess very few would deny that good leaders care passionately about the lives of their constituents, and they care about being able to govern well. And I think we should not treat care as something as a form of soft power, but it's actually very powerful in terms of really not only reimagining, but reshaping the way we live our lives. On the issue of communication, I just need to do a rejoinder. We seem to be making an assumption that there is a particular thing that needs to be communicated, risk, COVID-19, danger to people, and that they should be able to act on it appropriately. But then we are not really questioning where is this knowledge system coming from about what is the nature of this risk and how we should respond to this risk. From my own research, the way that people view risk and deem appropriate actions to deal with certain risks are quite different. And this is where care is very important, because as care responsibles, not just caregivers, but responsible for providing care, our government institutions, our leaders, and each other, we should be attentive to these different needs and knowledge systems that really shape the way we view our world. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kyra. Oscar?
Yeah. I just want to say that we live in unusual times, and this mode of life we have now on lockdown, glued to our screens, or concentrated in small pockets of our houses or communities with people, can actually produce a lot of energies, good and bad, right? And we see these energies playing out, in one sphere, such as the internet. And here we see so many issues previously repressed finally being aerated, right? Ventilated. And I think we just need to capture the momentum and be attentive to how things are shifting and reassembling as we deal with COVID-19. And now I think is not the time to foreclose possibilities. In fact, this is the time to imagine possibilities along the lines of what is currently happening while COVID-19 is raging on. So I think importante that we try to depart from binaries, but also recognize what I mentioned a while ago, unequal vulnerabilities of people. While all of us have this may take some claim on what I want to call the fantasy of autonomy and agency online, there are many instances offline that make us realize that we are unequally vulnerable, right? And for those of us who can afford to cushion ourselves from state violence, for example, we have to carry on reimagining the language in which we express dissent and remodify our modes of dissent. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, OJ. And again, we'd like to thank all our speakers for sharing their time and very provocative insights on this very important topic. And for all the participants, again, thank you so much for joining in. Nina, do you still have something to say?
Just as a final note, we have a CERN Melbourne YouTube channel, and we hope to upload this. We've taken a recording of it. We hope to upload it soon. And thank you again, everyone. Really appreciate your participation. And we look forward to having you in our next series. And good night, everyone. Bye.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.